Have you ever argued with yourself? Not in some poetic, metaphorical way, but genuinely felt like two different voices, two opposing wills, battling inside your skull for control? One part of you screaming to hit the snooze button, sink back into the warm embrace of sleep, while another part insists you need to get up, be responsible, face the day. One voice whispers that you should eat the cake, enjoy the moment, live a little, while another scolds you about discipline, health, consequences. We call this internal conflict, the war between desire and reason, impulse and restraint. We assume it's a metaphor, a way of describing the complexity of being human. But what if it isn't a metaphor at all? What if the sensation of being two people trapped in one body reflects a literal, physical reality hidden inside your brain? What if you don't have one consciousness but two operating simultaneously right now as you read these words? What if the unity you feel, the singular sense of I, is actually an illusion constructed by a thin bundle of nerve fibers desperately trying to keep two separate minds synchronized? And what if, when that connection is cut, the illusion shatters, revealing something so strange, so philosophically unsettling, that it forces us to reconsider what we even mean when we say I? This isn't speculation, this isn't science fiction. This is the result of one of the most disturbing and revelatory experiments in the history of neuroscience. Research so profound it earned a Nobel Prize, yet so deeply weird that it still makes scientists uncomfortable decades later. The story begins in the 1960s in a laboratory where a neuroscientist named Roger Sperry was about to prove that the human brain harbors not one consciousness but two each, capable of thinking, perceiving, and making decisions independently of the other. His subjects were epilepsy patients who had undergone a radical last-resort surgery to stop their seizures, a procedure that involved severing the corpus callosum, the thick cable of about 200 million nerve fibers connecting the left and right hemispheres of the brain. Doctors hoped that by cutting this connection, they could prevent seizures from spreading from one side to the other, trapping the electrical storm in half the brain instead of letting it engulf the whole. The surgery worked. Seizures became manageable, sometimes disappeared entirely. But something else happened, something the surgeons didn't anticipate and couldn't have predicted. On the surface, these patients seemed perfectly normal. They walked, talked, went about their daily lives without obvious difficulty. There were no visible signs that anything fundamental had changed. They didn't appear confused, didn't show dramatic personality shifts, didn't seem disabled in any conventional sense. And yet, when Roger Sperry began testing them with carefully designed experiments, he uncovered a truth so bizarre it redefined our understanding of consciousness itself. He discovered that when the connection between the hemispheres is severed, each half of the brain continues to function, but they function independently. Each hemisphere perceives, thinks, remembers, and acts on its own. In effect, the surgery hadn't just disconnected two halves of a brain, it had created two separate minds, coexisting in one skull, each unaware of the other's existence. The experiments Sperry devised were elegant and profoundly unsettling. He exploited a quirk of anatomy. Your left eye doesn't send information exclusively to your left brain, and your right eye doesn't feed only your right brain. Instead, the left half of each eye's visual field connects to the right hemisphere, and the right half connects to the left hemisphere. Normally, the corpus callosum instantly shares this information between hemispheres, so you experience a unified visual world. But in split-brain patients, that sharing stops. Show an image to the left visual field, and only the right hemisphere sees it. Show it to the right visual field, and only the left hemisphere knows it exists. Sperry used this to ask each hemisphere questions independently, and their answers revealed two consciousnesses operating in parallel. In one famous experiment, Sperry flashed an image of an apple to a patient's left visual field, meaning only the right hemisphere saw it. Then he asked, "What did you see?" The patient answered, "Nothing. I didn't see anything." But here it gets eerie. Sperry then asked the patient to reach behind a screen with their left hand controlled by the right hemisphere and pick out what they saw from a collection of objects. Without hesitation, the left hand grabbed the apple. The patient's mouth, controlled by the language-dominant left hemisphere, said they saw nothing, while their left hand, guided by the silent right hemisphere, knew exactly what was there. Two minds, one body, one speaking, denying, unaware. The other acting knowing, but unable to communicate through words. The left hemisphere, it turned out, is the one that talks. It handles language, logic, sequential reasoning, the narration of your life that runs as a constant internal monologue. When you think in words, when you plan your day, when you analyze a problem step by step, that's largely your left hemisphere at work. The right hemisphere, meanwhile, is the silent observer, specializing in spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, emotional nuance, the holistic perception of the world. It sees the forest where the left sees trees. It grasps the melody where the left dissects notes. And in split-brain patients, these two systems, no longer yoked together by the corpus callosum, pursue their own agendas independently. Sometimes those agendas conflict in ways both tragic and darkly comedic. One patient reported that his left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, would sometimes act against his will. He'd reach for a shirt with his right hand, choosing what to wear, and his left hand would grab a different shirt, as if a second person inside him disagreed with the choice. Another patient described his left hand trying to strangle his wife while his right hand fought to pull it away. The patients themselves were baffled, disturbed by the sensation that part of their body belonged to someone else, some other will, some other mind. Because literally, the right hemisphere, cut off from the left, made decisions on its own, pursued goals the speaking left hemisphere didn't endorse, didn't understand, and couldn't control. Sperry's work revealed that the two hemispheres even have different emotional responses, different preferences, different beliefs. In one study, researchers asked split-brain patients about their career aspirations, political views, or favorite activities, presenting the question separately to each hemisphere. The left hemisphere might describe a desire to be an architect, while the right, asked through yes or no questions it could answer by nodding or using the left hand, indicated a preference for being a race car driver. Same person, two answers, two desires. Which one is the real you? Well, neither? The question becomes philosophically unbearable. What Roger Sperry proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, is that consciousness is not a singular, indivisible essence housed somewhere in the brain. It's a function that emerges from neural activity, and when you split the neural substrate, you split the consciousness. The unity you feel, the sense that you are one continuous self, depends entirely on the corpus callosum, weaving the outputs of two separate hemispheres into a single, coherent narrative. Cut that connection and the illusion falls away, exposing what was always there: two systems, two perspectives, two experiences of being alive, running in parallel. For this work, Roger Sperry received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1981, a recognition that his discoveries had fundamentally altered how we understand the mind. But the implications go far beyond neuroscience. If you can have two consciousnesses when the hemispheres are disconnected, what does that say about the rest of us walking around with our corpus callosum intact? Are we two dual beings, just better integrated? When you feel torn between two choices, when one part of you wants something and another part resists, is that the echo of two minds normally synchronized, momentarily pulling in opposite directions? And if so, which one is you, the one that speaks? The one that observes silently, both? Even more disturbing, if consciousness can be split by cutting nerve fibers, then consciousness is not a soul, not an immaterial essence, but a process generated by physical brain structures. Damage the structure, and you damage or divide or erase the consciousness. This sits uncomfortably with many of our deepest intuitions about selfhood, about identity, about what it means to be a person. If you can be divided into two, are you really a unified self at all? Or just a collection of processes that usually, but not always, cooperate? The split-brain patients force us to confront these questions not as abstract philosophy, but as lived reality. They experience what the rest of us only fear: the dissolution of the singular I, the emergence of another will within their own body, acting with intention, with knowledge, with desire, entirely separate from the self they recognize as themselves. It's a mirror held up to the hidden architecture of every human mind, showing us that the boundary between one and two, between unity and multiplicity, is thinner and more fragile than we ever imagined. And here's the final chilling twist: you don't need surgery to glimpse this duality. Even with your corpus callosum intact, the two hemispheres of your brain are constantly negotiating, compromising, sometimes competing for control. Every decision you make, every thought you think, emerges from the interaction of these two systems, each bringing its own strengths, biases, and agendas to the table. You are, in a very real sense, a collaboration between two minds that learned, through millions of years of evolution, to act as one. But the seams are there, visible in moments of indecision, in the feeling of being pulled in two directions, in the strange sensation that part of you wants something your conscious, verbal self would never admit. So the question remains hovering over everything. When you say I, which hemisphere is speaking? When you make a choice, is it one mind deciding or two minds negotiating? And if the connection were severe tomorrow, which of the two consciousnesses that emerge would be the real you, the one that talks, or the one that silently watches? The answer, as you'll discover, is far stranger than you think. Because the truth about consciousness, about selfhood, about the you reading these words, is that it was never singular to begin with. You've been two all along. You just didn't know it. So as split-brain patients live with two separate consciousnesses, two minds coexisting in one body, what does that mean for you? You didn't have surgery. Your corpus callosum is intact, connecting your left and right hemispheres with hundreds of millions of nerve fibers, synchronizing their activity every millisecond of your waking life. Does that mean you have one consciousness, unified and indivisible? Or does it mean you have two consciousnesses that are simply better at cooperating, better at maintaining the illusion of singularity? The answer is more unsettling than you might expect, because the evidence suggests that even with your brain fully connected, you are still fundamentally dual. Still a negotiation between two systems that don't always agree, don't always want the same things, and occasionally compete for control of your actions. Think about the last time you made a difficult decision. Maybe it was whether to quit a job, end a relationship, move to a new city, say something you knew would cause conflict. Do you remember the feeling? Not the abstract weighing of pros and cons, but the visceral, almost physical sensation of being torn, pulled in opposite directions by forces that felt equally you, yet incompatible. One voice insisting you take the risk, embrace change, trust your instincts. Another voice warning you to stay safe, avoid regret, think it through more carefully. You probably experienced this as internal dialogue, a conversation with yourself. But what if it wasn't a conversation? What if it was two consciousnesses, two perspectives, two decision-making systems running in parallel, each lobbying for its preferred outcome, with the final choice emerging not from a singular you, but from whichever system, in that moment, held slightly more sway? Neuroscience increasingly suggests this is closer to reality than metaphor. Even in people with intact brains, the two hemispheres maintain distinct processing styles, priorities, and biases. The left hemisphere, verbal and analytical, constructs narratives, seeks patterns, explains events in terms of cause and effect. It's the storyteller, the rationalist, the part of you that insists everything makes sense, even when it doesn't. The right hemisphere, silent and holistic, perceives context, reads emotional undertones, grasps the bigger picture without needing words. It's the intuitive observer, the pattern recognizer, the part of you that knows something is wrong before you can articulate why. These two systems don't just process information differently, they often reach different conclusions. And when they do, you feel it as conflict, as indecision, as the maddening sensation of not knowing what you really want. But here's where it gets stranger. The left hemisphere doesn't just differ from the right in how it thinks, it differs in what it believes is real. In split-brain patients, researchers discovered that the left hemisphere, when confronted with actions initiated by the right hemisphere, doesn't admit ignorance. Instead, it invents explanations, constructs stories, rationalizes behaviors it had no part in planning. In one famous experiment, a split-brain patient's right hemisphere was shown the command walk in the left visual field. The patient stood up and started walking toward the door. When asked why, the left hemisphere, which never saw the command, didn't say, "I don't know." It said, "I'm going to get a Coke." The left brain, unable to access the right brain's knowledge, confabulated a reason, created a narrative that made the action seem intentional, coherent, chosen. This phenomenon, called confabulation, isn't unique to split-brain patients. It happens in all of us, constantly, invisibly shaping the story we tell ourselves about who we are and why we do what we do. Your left hemisphere is a relentless narrator, and it will explain your behavior even when it doesn't actually know the cause. You reach for a snack because you're stressed, but your left brain says you're hungry. You avoid a conversation because you're afraid, but your left brain says you're busy. You fall in love because of a complex interplay of chemistry, timing, and unconscious associations, but your left brain writes a story about destiny, compatibility, soulmates. The you that speaks that thinks in words, that believes it knows why you do what you do, is often just guessing, filling in gaps, constructing a coherent narrative from fragments of information it doesn't fully understand. So the unity you experience, the feeling that your decisions come from a single, rational self, is partly an illusion maintained by the left hemisphere's storytelling. Beneath that narrative, multiple systems are at work, some conscious, some unconscious, some verbal, some silent, each contributing to the outcome, each pulling in its own direction. You are not one mind making decisions. You are a parliament of neural systems negotiating, compromising, sometimes overruling each other, with the final result announced by the left hemisphere as if it had been the plan all along. This is why, after making a choice, you sometimes feel surprise, regret, or confusion about what you just did. Part of you may be the right hemisphere, maybe a subcortical structure, maybe an unconscious process acted, and another part of you, the verbal narrator, is scrambling to explain it. Now consider what this means for concepts like free will, responsibility, identity. If your decisions emerge from a negotiation between systems you don't fully control or even perceive, can you truly claim ownership of your actions? When you say, "I chose this," which I are you referring to? The left hemisphere that narrates the choice? The right hemisphere that influenced it silently? The limbic system that generated the emotional impulse? The prefrontal cortex that weighed consequences? All of them, acting in concert? Or none of them, because you, as a unified agent, don't actually exist, just a loose coalition of processes that usually cooperate but sometimes don't. Split brain research doesn't just reveal what happens when the brain is divided, it reveals what was always true but hidden by the corpus callosum's ability to integrate. You are multiple. You always have been. The difference between you and a split brain patient isn't that you have one consciousness and they have two. It's that your two consciousnesses communicate more effectively, synchronize more seamlessly, present a more convincing performance of unity. But the seams are there, visible in every moment of indecision, every act of self-sabotage, every time you do something and then wonder why. And here's the truly disorienting part. If you are two minds, which one is the real you? The one that talks? That seems like the obvious answer after all. The verbal self is the one you identify with, the one narrating your life, the one reading these words right now. But the right hemisphere is no less conscious, no less aware. It perceives, it remembers, it makes decisions. In split-brain patients, it demonstrates preferences, emotions, intentions entirely separate from the left hemispheres. It is by every meaningful measure, a mind. A silent mind, yes, but a mind nonetheless. So when you think of yourself as I, are you excluding half of your own consciousness? Is the right hemisphere a passenger, a subordinate, or an equal partner you've never properly acknowledged? Some researchers have suggested that the right hemisphere is the true observer, the part of you that watches your life unfold, without constantly narrating it, the quiet awareness beneath the chatter of language. Others argue that neither hemisphere is more you than the other, that the self is the emergent property of their interaction, something that only exists when they work together. And still others propose that the question itself is flawed, that there is no singular you to locate, just processes, patterns, shifting configurations of neural activity that we mistakenly reify into a unified identity. Philosopher Thomas Nagel once asked, "What is it like to be a bat?" Exploring the subjective experience of a creature with a fundamentally different sensory apparatus. But an equally profound question is, what is it like to be a split-brain patient? Do they experience themselves as one person or two? The answer, disturbingly, is both. They report feeling like themselves, singular and continuous, yet also describe moments of alienation, of watching their own hand act with volition they don't recognize as theirs. One patient said it felt like someone else is in there with me. Another described it as two people trying to drive the same car. These aren't metaphors, they're descriptions of lived experience, of what it actually feels like when the illusion of unity breaks down. You might think this is irrelevant to your life, that split-brain patients are rare medical anomalies with little to teach the rest of us. But recent neuroscience suggests the opposite. Studies using neuroimaging have shown that even in people with intact brains, the two hemispheres often activate in ways that suggest independent, sometimes conflicting, processing. When you're ambivalent, when you feel two ways about something, brain scans reveal asymmetric activation. One hemisphere leaning toward one choice, the other toward a different one. The corpus callosum doesn't eliminate this duality. It just forces a compromise, a weighted average of two perspectives that may not agree. And what about the moments when you act against your own stated intentions? You swore you'd go to the gym, but you drove home instead. You promised yourself you'd stay calm, but you lashed out. You knew the relationship was over, but you called anyway. The left hemisphere narrates these failures as weakness, inconsistency, lack of willpower. But maybe they're not failures at all, maybe they're evidence of your dual nature. Moments when one system wanted something different from what the verbal self declared, and that system, in the background, silently won. You are not a monolith. You are a negotiation. And sometimes the side that doesn't speak gets its way. There's a strange, almost tragic beauty in this realization. For so long, we've believed that the mind is a kingdom with one ruler, that I sit at the center of my being, making decisions, directing actions, owning my life. But the truth is more like a democracy, or perhaps a benevolent dictatorship, where the left hemisphere thinks it's in charge, writes all the official histories, takes credit for every decision, while the right hemisphere influences quietly, nudges from the periphery, occasionally overrules the official narrative without ever getting acknowledged. You are a collaboration, you are a duet, and most of the time, you don't even realize one of the singers is there. So what do you do with this knowledge? How does it change the way you live, the way you understand yourself, the way you make choices? First, it suggests humility. The you that narrates your life, that believes it knows why you do what you do, is not as omniscient as it pretends. You are partly a mystery to yourself, and that's okay. It's not a flaw, it's the architecture of being human. Second, it suggests patience. When you feel torn, when you struggle to decide, you not weak or indecisive, you experiencing the normal operation of a dual system, trying to find agreement. Conflict is built into the structure of your mind. And third, it suggests curiosity. Pay attention to the silent part of you, the part that doesn't speak but knows things, feels things, sees things the verbal self misses. That's not just intuition or gut feeling, it's another consciousness, equally real, equally you, trying to communicate in the only language it has. In the end, the split brain experiments reveal a truth so fundamental it reshapes everything we thought we knew about consciousness, identity, and the self. You are not one. You are two. Two perspectives, two decision makers, two streams of awareness woven so tightly together that you mistake the tapestry for a single thread. The corpus callosum doesn't create unity, it creates the illusion of unity, a seamless performance that hides the duality beneath. And when that performance is disrupted, when the connection is severed, the truth emerges. You were always plural, always a conversation, always a negotiation between minds that happen to share a skull. The question, then, is not whether you have two consciousnesses. The question is whether you'll acknowledge the one that's been there all along. Silent and patient, watching everything, feeling everything, knowing you in ways the verbal self never will. Because the moment you do, the moment you recognize the duality within, something shifts. You stop being one confused mind and start being two minds in dialogue, two perspectives in collaboration, two halves of a whole that was never supposed to be singular. And maybe, just maybe, that's when you finally become who you were always meant to be. Not one person pretending to be whole, but two minds finally meeting, finally speaking, finally understanding that together they are something far greater than either could ever be alone.